For 22 years, I was the engine running quietly beneath the surface of the company. I was the name no one noticed on the plaques but always appeared on the contracts. My name is Olivia Tran, and I was the Senior Director of Business Development at Arvotech. I joined the company when it was just a startup with mismatched furniture and second-hand coffee machines. Back then, the CEO still brought his dog to work, and I was one of 3 people doing everything from sales to customer service. I didn't care, I loved it. I worked late nights, missed birthdays, skipped vacations, and pushed through migraines to close deals. My reward wasn't glory, it was the satisfaction of seeing our company grow. I became known internally as the closer. When a contract looked impossible, they sent Olivia. I had a calm voice, a steel spine, and an ability to read rooms better than anyone else. And more importantly, I cared about people, about clients, about what our work stood for. But caring isn't trendy in the age of disruption. Not when a new wave of leadership rolls in, armed with buzzwords and blind arrogance. It started subtly, my team shrank. Then my name disappeared from press releases. I was being pushed out, but no one had the guts to say it out loud. Until one Tuesday morning in February. I arrived early as always, a cup of jasmine tea in hand. The office was quiet, the way I liked it before the noise of ambition took over. Then I saw the calendar alert, meeting with Ethan, HR present. My stomach dropped. Ethan was our new CEO, 32, Stanford MBA, all charm and no memory. He barely looked me in the eye when we passed in the hallway. In the meeting room, he was waiting with Jenna from HR, both looking too rehearsed. My seat felt like a trap. "We appreciate your years of service, Olivia," Ethan began like he was reading from a greeting card. "But we're restructuring to align with our forward-looking vision." Forward-looking. As if I'd been walking backward all these years. I didn't cry. I nodded, signed the papers, and left with a smile he didn't understand. He thought he had power. What he didn't know was that I had just spent the last 8 months negotiating a $10 million partnership with a Japanese conglomerate. A deal built on trust, nuance, and endless hours of midnight Zoom calls. I had handpicked the team. I'd even flown to Tokyo twice, learning enough Japanese to greet their board respectfully. The deal was 90% there. Only one signature remained, Mr. Yamato's. And he had made it clear he only dealt with me. Ethan thought he inherited that deal. He planned a celebration party for the board. He didn't know that Yamato-san and I had a private understanding. I had told him I might be leaving. He had looked me in the eye and said, "We do not shake hands with shadows." I remember bowing deeply that night, not just out of respect but gratitude. So when I packed my things in that cold, clinical silence, I didn't pack regret. I packed memories and confidence. I had built bridges. Ethan had just set fire to the one he needed most. The next morning, I sat at home in my quiet kitchen, watching the sun hit my orchids. My phone buzzed, an international number. It was Yamato-san. "I heard I will not proceed without you," he said simply. I closed my eyes and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The contract wasn't his to inherit. It had always been mine. And I was just getting started. I didn't waste time mourning the job. Instead, I poured myself a fresh cup of tea and opened a clean notebook. The silence of my kitchen became my war room. No bitterness, just clarity. Arvotech thought I was finished. But they had underestimated the value of trust, the quiet power of earned relationships. I drafted an email to Yamato-san. Brief, professional, but laced with purpose. I was no longer with Arvotech, but I remained committed to our shared vision. His reply came within an hour. "We meet Tokyo, my office." I booked my flight that evening. I landed in Japan to the familiar scent of sakura and jet fuel. The sky was a slate gray, and yet everything felt bright. Mr. Yamato's building stood like a fortress of glass. Security knew my name before I introduced myself. Inside his office, the walls whispered tradition. Scrolls, tea sets, the soft ticking of an antique clock. He gestured for me to sit, no translator present. "I trust you," he said in English. He poured the tea himself. That's when I knew this wasn't just a formality. "We want you, Olivia-san," he continued. "Not just for the contract, for leadership." I blinked. He nodded slowly. "We plan to expand. You will lead North America." It took me a moment to absorb it. They weren't just offering me a role, they were giving me a legacy. And it was mine to accept or refuse. I asked for 24 hours. I returned to my hotel and stood by the window, watching neon reflections dance across the glass. Could I leave everything familiar behind? Arvo Tech had been my life, but they had thrown me away like a broken files. Now I had a chance to define myself anew. On my terms. I emailed Yamato-sen my answer before sunrise. A single line, yes, I accept. By noon, the press release went out. Yamato Corporation names Olivia Tran as Chief Expansion Officer, North America. I didn't check LinkedIn, but I didn't need to. The storm would come, and Ethan would be caught in the eye of it. A week later, I sat at a conference table in New York. Same city, different altitude. We were preparing for a crucial investor round. Yamato Corp's entry into the American market was seismic, and I would be its face. Across from me sat top advisors, marketing heads, legal counsel, all looking to me for direction. I spoke with precision. Not arrogance, but assurance. They listened. They followed. Later that day, I received a call. From Ethan. I let it ring 5 times before answering. Olivia, hey, it's been a whirlwind over here. I said nothing. He chuckled awkwardly. So, small issue, the Yamato deal stalled. I allowed the silence to stretch. He filled it nervously. They won't sign, said they need you, any chance you'd advise us just to close it out? I almost laughed. But I didn't. Ethan, I said calmly, you don't close deals by deleting people, you close them by honoring them. He fumbled through another sentence. Something about mutual benefit and putting the past behind us. I ended the call politely. And I didn't call back. That afternoon, I stood beside Yamato-san at a press event. The flash of cameras didn't faze me. When asked about the partnership, Yamato responded in Japanese. The translator looked at me as if to confirm the words. I nodded. He said we follow trust, not corporations. The crowd murmured. The narrative had shifted. I wasn't the woman who had been let go. I was the one who had risen. Later that week, news broke. Arvo Tech stock dipped. The deal's failure spooked investors. Questions swirled. Ethan issued a lukewarm statement. Due to unforeseen personnel changes, the Yamato agreement is no longer viable. I read it over coffee, a quiet smile on my lips. He still hadn't learned to say my name. But the industry had. Emails poured in, offers, invitations, interviews. I responded to none. I was focused. Because this wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. The kind that doesn't shout. It builds, brick by steady brick. And I was laying the foundation of something far greater than a title. I was building legacy. And no one could fire that from me. 3 months passed, and my world no longer resembled the one I had been forced to leave. I was flying across states weekly, speaking at summits, building teams, and finalizing regional partnerships with precision. Every room I entered now paused, not because I demanded attention, but because my presence carried weight. I no longer had to prove my worth, my results spoke louder than I ever could. Yamato Corporation thrived under our North American strategy. We opened our first satellite office in Austin, followed by branches in Chicago and Seattle. Each location bore the same philosophy, led with integrity, build with trust. It was everything Arvo Tech used to be before vision turned into vanity. Meanwhile, Ethan's name continued circulating for all the wrong reasons. Rumors surfaced about internal mismanagement, high turnover, and missed targets. They had bet on new blood and forgotten the veins that carried wisdom. I wasn't surprised. But I didn't gloat. Not in public. Still, in quiet moments, I allowed myself a sliver of satisfaction. Not out of spite, but closure. Then came the invitation. A prestigious business leadership panel hosted by Forbes Women in Leadership. I stared at the email for a long time. A strange mix of pride and disbelief welled up inside me. The panel would be held in San Francisco. My old home. The same city where Ethan had once dismissed me as obsolete. The same skyline I used to look at from a windowless office. Now I would return as a headliner. I didn't hesitate to accept. When the day arrived, I wore a navy blue pantsuit tailored in Tokyo. Minimal jewelry, firm heels, and a sense of purpose. The ballroom shimmered with ambition. Hundreds of women from across the country gathered to hear our stories. I sat backstage, calm but electric. Then the coordinator whispered, "You're up in 5s." I stood, straightened my blazer, and walked into the light. Applause greeted me, not polite but genuine. I stepped to the podium, my fingers steady on the edge. And then I spoke. Not about betrayal, but about becoming. About how sometimes the end of one chapter is just the refusal to write more of the same. About the difference between being let go and letting go. I told them about jasmine tea at dawn and late-night emails that opened doors no one else could see. About loyalty and when it turns into self-erasure. I told them how being fired freed me. How dignity doesn't come from titles but from truth. When I finished, the room stood. Not out of sympathy but solidarity. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, I saw a familiar face. Not Ethan but Maria, my former assistant. She approached me afterward, eyes bright. "You gave me the courage to quit," she said. "I'm launching my own consulting firm. I wouldn't have believed I could until today." I hugged her without words. This was the legacy I wanted. Not numbers in a ledger, but lives transformed. That evening at the gala dinner, I was seated at the center table. A woman in a red dress leaned over, introducing herself as a board member of a Fortune 100. "We're looking for someone to lead a new innovation branch," she said. "I've followed your work since the Yamato deal." I smiled. Not because I needed more work, but because the world was finally recognizing the invisible labor we so often gave away for free. As the music played and glasses clinked, I stepped out onto the balcony alone. San Francisco sparkled below. And for the first time in years, it felt like mine again. Not a city that had spit me out, but one I had returned to with grace and fire. In that moment, I thought of the people still trapped in the rooms I had escaped. I sent a silent message to every woman who ever swallowed her voice to keep a seat at the table. Build your own table. Make it wider. And never let anyone convince you your story ended because they closed one chapter. You are the pen. And you are just getting started. The weeks following the Forbes panel were a whirlwind. Not of chaos, but of clarity. I was no longer building someone else's dream, I was expanding my own. Yamato Corporation had granted me freedom within structure, a rare and precious balance. Every decision I made shaped the future of our American division. Every hire I approved brought new fire into our teams. But it wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal. I'd begun mentoring young women through a leadership fellowship I helped establish. We called it RiseLine. It started as monthly webinars but quickly evolved into an in-person summit. The inaugural event would be held in Washington, D.C., a city humming with ambition. I spent nights crafting the keynote. Not for applause, but for impact. I wanted these women to walk away with more than hope. I wanted them to walk away with strategy. Tools. I reached out to former colleagues, women who had also been overlooked, downsized, dismissed. They were hungry to give back. Together, we built a coalition. Not against men, but for equity. Meanwhile, Ethan resurfaced. A scandal involving misreported earnings had reached the media. Shareholders were outraged. Arvotech's board called an emergency session. A week later, headlines read, "Ethan Karp steps down amid financial scrutiny." I read it without surprise. But I did feel something I hadn't expected, sorrow. Not for him, but for the company I once loved. It had been a second home, a labor of loyalty. And now it was unraveling from the top down. 2 days later, an anonymous call came through our reception desk at Yamato North America. The receptionist forwarded it with a puzzled tone. "It's from a board member at Arvotech," she said. "He asked to speak with you directly." I picked up, my voice steady. "Olivia Tran." The man introduced himself as David Rains. He was part of the founding team, someone I remembered from the early years. "Olivia, we've made mistakes," he began. "There's no sugarcoating it, we need help." He proposed a meeting. In person, off record. I agreed, but not out of loyalty. Out of curiosity. We met at a quiet cafe in Palo Alto. David looked older, heavier with regret. We let ambition blind us, he said. Ethan was supposed to be the future, but we misjudged his character. He slid a file across the table. We want to rebuild. Inside were financials, market losses, and a single-page proposal, a contract to hire me as a senior consultant. I closed the folder without reading. David, I said gently, you can't rebuild with the same blueprint. He looked down ashamed. I'm not coming back, I added. But I will recommend someone who's ready. I gave him the name of a woman I mentored, Ava Chen. She was sharp, ethical, and ready for fire. The world didn't need another Olivia. It needed more leaders with hearts. He nodded slowly. Thank you, even this honesty helps. I left the cafe lighter. The past no longer tugged at me. Later that night, I received a message from Ava. She'd been offered the interim operations director role. I'm terrified, she wrote. But I'm stepping into it because you did first. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I stared at her words, letting them settle. I had once been the one watching from the sidelines. Now I was helping others walk onto the field. The next morning, I stood before my RiseLine team. We were preparing for the summit. My assistant handed me a box. Inside was a plaque to Olivia Tran. She rose so we could rise. I held it for a long time. It was more valuable than any title I had ever worn. I had been fired, but I had never been finished. And now I was building an empire on the ruins of dismissal. Not out of revenge, but rebirth. Because when they closed the door on me, they didn't end my story. They just freed my hands to write a better one. As the RiseLine summit neared, my days filled with purpose and a kind of motion that felt effortless. Not because the work was easy, but because every action now aligned with a deeper calling. We rented out a historic venue in Georgetown, complete with high ceilings and tall windows that poured sunlight into the old hardwood floors. The space felt sacred, like it was meant for ideas, stories, and transformation. I arrived 3 days early with my team. We rehearsed logistics, checked sound systems, and fine-tuned every moment to leave no detail to chance. But what I was most excited about wasn't on the schedule. It was a quiet round table I'd arranged, an off-the-record session for women in transition. Former executives. Burned-out mid-level managers. Women who had been let go, passed over, or silenced. Women who still carried the weight of invisible rooms. We met in the West Wing, tucked away behind velvet curtains. No press, no photos, no pretense. Just folding chairs, warm light, and raw honesty. Each woman introduced herself not by title, but by turning point. I was laid off 2 weeks after giving birth. I was replaced by a man who quoted my own report back to me. I left because I refused to work 12 hours a day for someone who didn't know my name. The pain was real, but so was the power. By the end of 2 hours, I saw something I hadn't seen in a while, belief returning to their eyes. Not in the system, but in themselves. When we hugged goodbye, I knew we'd just built something no keynote ever could. We'd created a circle of resilience. The next day, the official summit began. Hundreds of women poured in from every corner of the country. They came in heels, flats, sneakers, power-dressed in every form. The air buzzed with anticipation, not of celebrity, but of substance. I opened the event with a short welcome. Then I stepped aside. Because RiseLine wasn't about one voice. It was about many. Speakers came from every background: engineering, law, healthcare, art. Each one brought a truth no algorithm could quantify. During the break, I walked alone through the corridor. I paused at the display wall where attendees had pinned handwritten notes of intention. I will ask for what I deserve. I will not apologize for taking space. I will rebuild on my own terms. Each card felt like a promise not just to self, but to sisterhood. That evening, as the crowd settled for the final session, I felt the weight of the moment. Not heavy, but meaningful. I walked up to the stage, not as the closer, not as the consultant, but as the woman who had once sat in the back of the room, afraid she didn't belong. I spoke not from a podium, but seated on a stool. Level with them. I shared the story of how getting fired wasn't the end of my career. It was the beginning of my freedom. I told them how I'd once stayed in a job too long because I confused loyalty with worth. How I'd smiled through being sidelined, thinking it made me strong. But true strength, I learned, comes when we stop begging to be seen and start building spaces where we see each other. The room was silent. Then came tears. Not just mine, but theirs. I ended by telling them what I wish someone had told me. You are not broken, you are just beginning. As the lights dimmed and applause rose, I stood slowly. The summit had ended, but something else had begun. The next morning, I received an email from a publishing house. They wanted to offer me a book deal. Not a business memoir, but a manifesto, a guide for women navigating reinventions. They had heard about the summit. I stared at the email, heart steady. Then I opened a blank document. I began typing not as an expert, but as a witness. To all the women who had refused to disappear. To all the Olivias out there still waiting for permission. I wrote, this is not a story about being fired. This is a story about becoming unstoppable. The morning the book launched, I stood in my kitchen once again, tea in hand, just as I had that February day I was fired. Only this time the silence wasn't laced with confusion or grief, it was full of peace. The book had gone to print 6 months after the RiseLine summit. It was called Permission Not Needed. It wasn't a bestseller overnight, but it spread like wildfire through women's networks, book clubs, and college campuses. I received hundreds of letters, not emails, real letters. Handwritten, heartfelt humans. One came from a woman in her 60s who had just left a toxic job after 30 years. Another from a girl who'd read the book under her blanket with a flashlight so her parents wouldn't know. They all said some version of the same thing, you reminded me I'm not invisible. And each time I read one, I felt something stronger than success, I felt connected. Yamato Corporation thrived. We'd expanded into Canada, opened a new tech incubator in Austin, and hired over 400 employees in under 2 years. But my proudest achievement wasn't on paper. It was the rise of women around me. Ava Chen had transformed Arvotech's culture from within. She initiated mentorship programs, increased pay transparency, and doubled female leadership in 18 months. We met for coffee one sunny morning. She looked radiant, tired, fulfilled. You know, she said, I used to think I had to become someone else to lead. Now I just bring all of me. I smiled, because I knew that journey well. Meanwhile, RiseLine was no longer a program. It had become a movement. We had chapters in 12 cities and growing. High school girls, early career professionals, even retired women came together to write their next chapters. I didn't attend every event. That wasn't the point. It wasn't about me anymore. It never really was. The movement had outgrown the moment that birthed it. And that's how I knew it was real. Still, every now and then, I visited the old Arvotech building. Not to look back in anger, but to remember. To honor what was and how far I'd come. One afternoon, I stood across the street watching a group of young employees head inside. They laughed, held coffee cups, talked about pitches and meetings. None of them knew me. And that was perfect. Because legacy isn't about being remembered by everyone. It's about changing enough lives that someone else carries the light forward. I walked away smiling, no longer needing to prove anything. A few weeks later, I was invited to deliver a commencement address. Stanford. The irony wasn't lost on me. The school where Ethan had once been hailed as a visionary now asked me to speak on resilience. I stood before a sea of graduates in crimson robes. And I told them the truth. I told them that the world would often define them by their titles, their salaries, their metrics. But none of that was legacy. Legacy is how you make people feel. What you build when no one's watching. And what you choose to do when someone tells you that you're finished. I ended with a promise, you are not replaceable, you are unrepeatable, live like it. The standing ovation was humbling. But it was the look on one student's face in the third row that stayed with me. She had tears in her eyes and a notebook in her hand. She reminded me of me. Back when I thought playing small was the only way to be allowed in the room. Back before I learned I could build the room myself. After the ceremony, she found me. Her name was Layla. Thank you, she whispered. You just gave me permission to start. I hugged her, and I meant it. Because all of this, all the fire, the loss, the rebuilding, it wasn't just about me reclaiming a career. It was about creating a blueprint for the next Layla, and the one after her. That night, I sat on my balcony with the journals. I didn't write goals. I wrote gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the path it revealed. I had once been discarded by a company that saw me as outdated. But I had become something timeless. Not a name on a roster, but a name that meant change. I turned the last page of my journal, wrote 4 words: fired, freed, fierce, forever.